So today we live in a world that seems increasingly focused on division, on drawing lines, on building walls, and what makes us different from one another. And tonight I'd like to talk to you about using photography as a means of connecting us, as a way of furthering understanding outside of worlds of our own. At their best, images transcend race, religion, gender, social and political status, sexual orientation. They can help us to connect to people other than ourselves. I've always viewed photography as a means to an end. My camera as a tool to be used wisely. Though I'm based here in Pittsburgh, I've had the privilege of traveling throughout much of the Middle East and parts of Africa over the course of the past several years. In doing so, I've learned firsthand the importance of bearing witness. By now, most of us have heard about the refugee crisis, what is now being called the world's largest humanitarian disaster. Earlier this year, the UNHCR came out with a statistic that 65 million people are currently displaced worldwide. Now, 65 million, it's an incredible number. But huge numbers and statistics are a bit mind-numbing, aren't they? What does that even mean? What does it look like when someone is forced from home? What does displacement mean? What does it look like when a human being is forced to make a decision between an impossible existence and a very uncertain future? In northern Jordan, on the border with Syria, it looks like about 100,000 people forced to live within tents in 3 square miles. It looks like Omar, age 5, and Zainab, age 4. It looks like Al-Samara, age 12, from Homs, and Amal, age 8, from Damascus. This is Ali, he's 7, also from Homs. And this is Naja, age 7. And this is Khalid and his 3 daughters. So I met all of these folks and many others while working in the Zaatari refugee camp last summer. Most of them are still there. Their futures remain a question mark. Now in Lebanon, a country that holds the distinction of hosting the most refugees per capita of any other country in the world, displacement looks a lot like families trying to find refuge in dilapidated or abandoned buildings like this one. This is an old cafe. I met 17 people that were living in here at the time. They'd been there for 2 years when I had met them, and they had all fled the conflict in Syria. Or people are finding safe spaces in refugee ghettos, was what they were calling them, like this one. This is Adnan. Adnan, I interviewed him, and when I asked him what his hopes were for the future, he paused for a moment, and then he told me that he hoped for a warm bath and to return to school someday, in that order. In Iraq, earlier this year, as the battle for Mosul took place, displacement looked like tens of thousands of people picking up their most precious belongings and walking the many miles to relative safety, or getting into whatever forms of transportation they could find, heading for anywhere from where they called home. Across the region and across much of the world, refugees, or IDPs, internally displaced persons, often end up inside of camps like this one, the Hassan Sham camp in northern Iraq, or Kurdistan. It was in this camp that I met many women who would wait in lines for many hours each day, looking for food and or medical care for themselves or for their kids. It's also where I met Ali, So what was happening in Mosul was Ali was one of many children and one of many people being held in ISIS-controlled neighborhoods. These areas were cut off from food and water, access to medicine, pretty much everything. So he was extremely malnourished, and we found out that he had been living on rice water for the past 4 months. It's also where I met Wafa and her son Suleiman. And I can still hear her voice. I can still hear the pain in this mother's voice as she told me about not being able to provide for her child. So this camp is also where I met Yunus. And Yunus is like so many other school-aged men and women around the world who have been displaced from conflict, who had to drop their studies at the time. Prior to conflict coming to Mosul, he was in school studying medicine. Yunus lost both of his legs when he was used as a human shield by Daesh or ISIS. Yet in spite of these incredible circumstances in all of these places, every single day I was struck by the resiliency and the perseverance of pretty much everyone, of the kids' ability to smile, and really just the heroic nature of humanity in all of these places. So when I was working in Mosul, I was with a medical team. So I'd sleep at their trauma stabilization point, or TSP, and then I'd photograph their work. I'd gone there with the hope that I might be able to add to the narrative, to go beyond what we were hearing about in the headlines, when we were hearing about anything. During the nights, we were often awakened by airstrikes. So when I say airstrike, or shelling, or bombing, or when you hear these words in the news, what do you think of? Is there an image that comes to mind? If you're like most of us, and even myself prior to this experience, you're not often asked to consider the human face of war. War looks like a lot of things, but on June 12th, it looked like Lena. Lena's 4 years old and from West Mosul, and this occurred after an airstrike. It also looks like Amar, age 8. Now, both of these children did survive, thankfully. But this mother's son did not. So these are some of the faces of war that we rarely see. On May 31st of this year, there was an airstrike, and about 20 minutes later, I met Zainab. She's a 7-year-old girl from the Zinjili neighborhood of West Mosul. She arrived to the TSP, or the trauma stabilization point, and she was alive. And for the next hour, with her father's permission, I photographed as medics and then doctors did their best to save her life. This is Hassan, Zainab's father, moments after finding out that his little girl did not make it. So these images are rough, and I'm aware of that. And honestly, I debated a lot of whether or not to even share them with you tonight. But then I think back to those nights when this happened and this day. I mean, this was actually the first time that there's a difference between seeing a dead person and watching someone die. And I just remember how I felt that night and how I wanted to scream from the rooftops about these children, about innocence lost. I knew that at best they would become statistics, but I also knew that in a conflict like Mosul, record keeping was so poor that it was very unlikely that they'd even become that. So why show these photographs? As battlefields become more remote, and as technology has made war but an abstract notion to so many of us, it's the responsibility of photographers, journalists, humanitarian aid workers to be a witness to these things and then to share them with others. So what I'll say is that the universal language of photography tends to render the concept of war less alien, less abstract. It makes what's happening on the ground real to everyone else. Some people have become offended, even upset when I've shared these images with them. And I've considered that, and then I ask myself, how can we refuse to acknowledge a mere representation of a horrific act when others are forced to live through it? If we're big enough to fight a war, we should be big enough to look at it. It's just my opinion, but. So photographs can act as a bridge. They can transport us into the lives of people in faraway lands. But images and words can and should also be used as a way to better understand those living in our backyards. In this case, Pittsburgh or East Liberty. I've never had to travel very far to witness suffering or even displacement. The subject matter of displacement has been a controversial issue here in East Liberty for a very long time, perhaps most notably in the ultimate demolition of the Penn Plaza apartment buildings earlier this year. When I went there earlier this year, I met a man by the name of Gary Rivers. Gary is a Vietnam veteran and someone who dreamed of a new wardrobe, a nice dinner at Red Lobster, and who told me something I'll never forget. He said, "I'm an HB. I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm not orange, I'm not blue. I'm an HB, a human being." And that really stuck with me for a lot of reasons. First, I loved Gary because he helped to put a human face on what was happening in the Penn Plaza apartment buildings. And I also love that quote because it really got to the core of what I think is lacking in so much of today's society, our shared and very much common humanity, no matter race, religion, or where we call home. Every winter, on the longest night of the year, in the most livable city in this nation, there is a memorial to honor the men and women that have died living on our streets here in Pittsburgh. They are men like Tiger, someone who I met while volunteering at a shelter downtown about 5 years ago. His name is one of about 150 on plaques underneath the Fort Duquesne Bridge downtown. Working with Operation Safety Net, a phenomenal organization here in town that provides medical care to our homeless men and women, I've gotten to know many of these individuals. People like John, who's also a Vietnam veteran and a huge Pirates fan, and men like Sam, who told me about better days as he got a free haircut on the north side. And women like Marie, who, after a series of unfortunate events, found herself living on the streets. Now, these men and women are living in circumstances like this here in Pittsburgh. So these folks, if I had to be honest, are some of the best people I've ever met. And most of their stories defy any stereotype or any label that they've been branded with. The other thing is they're also our neighbors, and I'm going to continue to photograph them with the aspiration that I'm somehow able to do justice to their humanity, and in the hope that all of us here and everyone out there acknowledges them as our fellow human beings, just like Zainab and Ali and Omar and Giri. Now, earlier this summer, I had an exhibition downtown vandalized. The faces of Syrian children had X's put through their face with spray paint. Now, my reaction was not of anger, and unfortunately, it wasn't even surprise. It was profound disappointment and followed by conviction. If there was ever a time that we all needed to be bold and stand up in the face of hate, intolerance, and closed minds, it is now. It's been said that images can change the world, and I believe that. But it's not images alone. nor is it ever so black and white. It's really what we do with them. It's how we as viewers choose to engage with them. It's how we allow ourselves to be informed and changed, maybe moved to action. There's truth in the notion that the more aware we become, the more responsible we become. But my ask of you tonight is simple. View these and other images with empathy and a desire to learn from the experiences of people whose lives are so different and yet so similar to our own. People have asked me why I do what I do, and the truth is it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be let into people's lives. It's a privilege to hear people's stories, and it's a privilege to see parts of the world that so many may never see. But at the same time, it's also a responsibility to then share those stories with others, with you, here tonight. I'm humbled by this work. I've gained more from these experiences than any book that I've ever read, and from any experience I've ever had here in the comfort of my home of Pittsburgh. By sharing these people's faces, their names, their stories, and their experiences, my hope is that you are also able to gain from them. My promise to you is that I will absolutely never tell you what to think, but at the same time, I'm never going to hesitate to suggest what you think about. That's it.